Hello everyone, today we talk about the Hanseatic League, at least in medieval times. It's a very complicated history, and that's why I hesitated up to this point in, attempting at least a very short introduction like this one, because of course this is hopefully just the beginning of a series of videos about the Hanseatic League in the future. Perhaps at some point we can talk about it also for the modern era, for example. In the video about the Polish-Lithuanian 16th, 17th century army organization, we talked about the city militia of Danzig, right? That was essentially the largest city of the Hanse at that point, and we will see particularly also its growth in this context. So I think it's better to just go in medias res, starting from the etymology. Hanse is a old High German word which indicated a band or a troop, right? So a comitive, a fellowship that applied in an associationistic terms to bands of merchants, well, not pirates, as we will see, because the Hanseatic League was not born in a vacuum, right? There is this sort of distinctive, since Henry the Lion refound the city of Lubeck in 1151, we have. Yeah, that was very important. And by the way, I would like immediately to express my love for the Hanseatic cities that I had the lack of visiting in detail. And if you never have seen them, I really urge you to go there, because I honestly, as a European, never breathed a true atmosphere of freedom, a true spirit of independence like in the Hanseatic cities. Right, I'm not an enormous fan of the whole pack, meaning that, as we will see now, the major feature of the Hanseatic League is this pretty wide corporatism of essentially towns that individually were not particularly crafty, like they would have never succeeded alone. Right, and that's the reason why this wide association eventually took shape, right? There were internal divisions. Essentially, the reason why they got so powerful and wealthy was the weakness of the Scandinavian monarchies and the northern German principalities, the fact that the Poles had not awakened yet, the fact that also other parts, also in the west, for example, the rise of Holland, right? We made videos about all these various polities. So if we talk unavoidably about the Hanseatic League, for example, in the history of the Danish monarchy, the attacks on Copenhagen, for example, that witnessed literally how the Hanseatic fleet was more powerful than the Danish one at that point, at least because of the crippling political crisis was taking place. So that actually, and we will see it better at the end of this video, when the neighbors began to recompact, the individual towns, of course, remained important for trade as mercantile republics, and technically cities like Bremen and Hamburg, still within the German Federation today, are technically states. They're city-states. And that's actually what I want to stress about them, that if you really want to appreciate the spiritual relic, right, of a medieval commune, in its actual identity, also properly political phase, right? You visit these cities because they are really, really amazing, right? Bremen, Hamburg, Lubeck, Stralsund, Rostock. Again, there are many, because actually this, as we'll see now, is stretched like, and also with their guilds pretty far and wide. Right, there were certain Mediterranean cities that were part of the Hanseatic League. But today we'll try just to remain compact about the, let's say, the main picture. Then at some point we'll descend also in some further detail. Right, I will just leave you with this introduction with the note that is sculpted on a pillar in the Rathaus of Bremen, which rings something like that. Frei wie die Welle der hier vertraut, fest wie die Schwelle drauf hier gebaut. Which means free as the wave that you trust to essentially to seal on, firm like the threshold built here that referred to the Rathaus in that case, because it is in fact written on an actual threshold, and that word, like you enter it, the hall, and you read this, and it makes you think, right? Together with the atmosphere, with the symbols, with the sense of history that permeates those walls, and that, in my opinion, is one of the single most, say, not just poetic but open, right? Absolute ideas of freedom. Then again, it's not liberty, and this has a sad, in fact, downfall, given that, again, the systems are still, yes, states today, but they were taken over by the Prussians without much that could be done. They could do during the German unification, and so they are a memento towards, yes, at the success that freedom can give in the absence of a greater power, and the importance of liberty in this sense as instead something that is built within the range of at least of a higher authority, right, that has to help the community grow. So there are all some historical and philosophical digressions that I could take now, but I hope that knowing my work, at least if you do already well enough, you know what I mean overall, right? So the Hanse, as such, as a term, also indicates not just sea travel companies, but also terrestrial ones. So it's a broader band. Like, it's a term indicated even for troops, actually. Eventually, the term in Middle Low German came to mean an association of merchants, so a trader guild of sort. Other etymologies do not exist, actually, even though there are some consonances with Hanse, for example, means on the sea, but it has nothing to do with that, actually. So when you look at the prehistory of the Hanseatic League, you have to appreciate, of course, the traffics that since ever had been existing in the Baltic Sea, in the North Sea, and the fact that the region was coming out by the time of the refoundation of Lubeck in the 12th century from de facto a Viking dimension. The Scandinavian monarchies were Christianized, were built up feudally now, even though in an imperfect way, and they had simply redirecting their predatorial activities towards the east rather than the west, that had just come back on its feet without too many problems, telling the truth. And of course, the history of the Hanseatic League is definitely connected with the Ostsiedlung. So actually, it's the Germans, as you know, that lead the broader expansion towards the east that had involved also the Scandinavians. And this is, in fact, a very important feature of Hanseatic history, that is, in fact, the actual upper hand of this association over even the Scandinavian powers, the actual monarchies that laid north, right? When we look at, for example, some Norse activity in the Baltic Sea, as far as long trade connections were concerned, well, we can see Gotland surviving as an important trade center, differently from other hubs such as Birka and Aithabo that basically disappeared. They ended after the Viking era because they didn't have much of a urban foundation or some broader reason of existence aside as for slave marketplaces for in that particular time and place in history. The Gotlanders reached, for example, as far as the Rus, right, and especially Novgorod, that, as you know, would be quite connected with Hanseatic history, right? We know of the existence already of important markets in Viking era, Mecklenburg ports, also reaching up to what would have become Königsberg, that was called like that from made a video about him, Ottokar II of Bohemia. Present-day Kaliningrad, this was, in fact, the mountain, the King's Mountain, after Ottokar's crusading exploit against the Baltic pagans, as it was, they were the normal target for Central European noblemen in the first place. And so all these centers had known an important trade activity. And during the Viking era, under a Scandinavian land system, fundamentally. An interesting aspect about the Hanseatic League is also that it was never actually founded at some point in history. Again, the See of Lubeck, that was initially a Slavic settlement that got destroyed, in fact, in the tribal disputes between those peoples. It was rebuilt by Henry the Lion in 1159 and provided with important autonomies. We will see better now. Is just like the epiphenomenon of a broader development that was taking place. Lubeck would spiritually and in many ways also powerfully have the palm of the most important Hanseatic city. There was no such thing like a capital, but Lubeck definitely embodies that ideally. You see these centers being built in a time of interland expansion as well. It was very important for the House of Saxony and Bavaria at that point to have a port on the Baltic that was contended among various populations. There were troubles with Denmark. We will talk better about the history also of lands like Pomerania and more, right? The surroundings of Lubeck belonged to Adolf II of Holstein, Count of Schwerpunkt, as well, and that had been defeated by Henry the Lion. So you can see the clashes, of the background that would always have an important weight in actually even the moments of highest autonomy of the League. Right, there was a German hinterland that did affect the towns that were as free to associate as to cope with what were the traditional, comital powers that existed in the hinterland that would extend also lordship over them. So autonomy here, because of the lack essentially of a major German power in the area. I mean, even Saxony is something much more oriented towards continental Germany, politically wise at the time of the Welfen, the house of Henry the Lion. And so, in spite also of the best efforts of later nationalistic historiography, the reason why these towns prospered, and not individually much more than others, like, the Flemish communes, for example, but it is the fact that there was a power vacuum of sort in the area, right? That, yes, did embody some sort of, more archaic, sort of more romantic way of life, but also the necessity, in fact, of associating due to metus hostilis, and so, in fact, the main perils that began to emerge ever more frequently towards the end of the period and would lead towards the end of the Hanse. That had a, still it existed until the 60s of the 17th century, so it's not it disappeared overnight, but it had been by that point severely undermined. It simply ceased to be rather than being, dramatically conquered or whatever. And in fact, this is interesting as well. How spontaneously it formed and how spontaneously it also dissolved later on. Because these cities had an identity on their own individually. That's what they never went beyond, right? They didn't consider themselves primarily as Hanseatic towns, but first and foremost as these individual communes, right? That lived within that prosperity, but still as individuals, and with great issues with one another. There was also a territorial division where essentially four major areas that often quarreled against one another, couldn't quite, always agree on the, general direction, especially when politics began to be more complicated, but altogether associating as a major international trade association, they could make an enormous leverage on many powerful neighbors, right, and trade partners, right? Some of the greatest powers in Europe at the time, like England, for example, that, yes, was, of course, a much more powerful entity. Had it been transferred on northern Germany, would have taken over these cities, but of course couldn't, because it could not be transplanted hundreds of kilometers east. And so the position as well of these towns is what makes, importantly, their fortune among the other things, right? There is a great penetration also in the hinterland, as we will see, chiefly through the major riverways. The Rhine, that was historically very connected with England. The St. Henry the Lion that we mentioned right now was essentially, with the foundation of Lubeck and other towns, profiting a lot from that alliance that, as you know, was an anti-French Swabian one instead. And these areas of Europe are also rising faster in relative terms than others, right? I made a video about, for example, the difference in trade volume between Italy and Germany during the 14th century, and of course the Mediterranean was much more, it was much richer and developed also politically and institutionally. But countries like England, Germany, as less developed at the beginning of the Middle Ages, grew more in proportion to Southern Europe, countries like France or Italy. And this has, of course, even a widening effect in such a decentralized reality like the one of the Hanseatic towns, right? So especially during the 13th century, you have these centers skyrocketing, right? Mostly because of seaborne trade and their monopoly, de facto, of the North and Baltic Seas commerce, right? Lubeck also kept on growing. During the Middle Ages, its greatest power in relative terms was the 15th century. That was not the best one for the Hanse. So the first document we have about the Hanseatic League is in 1267. And again, the term Hanse per se did not have anything specific. It's just like saying company, right? There were many. It's just like when you say university. Every medieval association of sort was called university, if you know the etymology of the term, right? So the merchants of the different towns had been forming guilds known as Hanses, with the simple, again, necessities of trade association. We can make, if you want, also a more technical video about how they worked, also how they were regulated. They were the famous Lubeck rights, you will see in a while, become sort of standard. The most lucrative, the most common also items traded were timber, wax, amber, raisins, furs, along with rye and wheat, collected from the hinterland of the Baltic countries, mostly. Again, overall poor countries compared at least to the Western system, also how Germany was developing at that time in comparison. In fact, again, it's the Germans that really reactivate trade and urbanism, or actually created ex novo in this broader area, right? So there is a dominance that these German merchants really have overall in the area, and controlling as colonists that were backing for example, the Baltic Crusade. So together with knights, together with there is the foundation of the Teutonic Order, etc. They were sponsored, in fact, by the greatest power around, and they could afford to control the exports at the at the end of the major riverways, in fact in these portual towns that became also very German in nature. We've seen it importantly in videos like the ones, for example, about medieval Estonia, and we will refer to it a bit later as well. Right, their name as medieval corporations again were Universitates Mercatorum, so the universities of the merchants. And it's from these associations that the Hanseatic network of merchant guilds began to appear, because at the end of the day, the league was in fact a league between these various guilds. Nothing more, nothing less. The wide prevalence of these Germans spoke Middle Low German, which is witnessed by the impact in Scandinavian, Estonian, Latvian vocabulary, stemming literally from the German presence in the Baltic and beyond, so that the connections, the way the places these peoples would met, especially as merchants, were actually also more at a much wider range, hence also the necessities, especially certain technical terms. Everything mostly associated with arts and crafts is often of German origin. We've seen it also in some videos about Polish warfare, that in that case, especially the military, the feudal technical terms are essentially a Slavization of German names. You have, as we were saying before, a progressed trade network and market centers that helped, like the Hanse affirming itself. For example, Visby on the island of Gotland. At some point we will talk about the Battle of Visby as well for military reasons. 1361, if I'm not wrong. The merchants from this island had already been venturing, as we were saying before, as far as the Rus. They had established a trading post at Novgorod that they called Gutagard, in German Gotenhof. We are essentially in the 80s of the 11th century. So technically the Viking era had conventionally, at least historiographically, just ended, right? But at the end of the day, the same things pretty much were going on, right? By the 20s of the 12th century, Gotland was also gaining a significant autonomy from Sweden, that, as you know, took really a lot before taking off as a feudal monarchy, compared also to the other Scandinavian ones. Made videos about all these countries. We'll come back on it, single regions, provinces, if you're interested. In fact, Gotland would deserve a video on its own. And this naturally helped much the island's trade as well. That's also how German merchants began to settle, to make regular stops initially, on the same Gotland at Visby. In the 13th century, they would establish their own Kontor, that is essentially a major foreign trading post, and that would become associated, in fact, with the Hanseatic League in the same Novgorod. This is Peterhof, or Petershof, Saxon genitive, up to the river Volkhov, right? And this this river, by the way, connects the Lake Ilmen and Lake Ladoga, right? It forms parts of the basin of the Never River, even. So yes, they reach far and wide. And again, the main advantage, especially at this point in history, was just controlling, having this trading outpost at the portual river mouth, right? So this is what we've seen in other circumstances, also in the Mediterranean. As long as you hold that and you have enough naval power to simply supply those quarters from the sea, which was not always the case, right? But if you had enough naval force, at least to, in fact, also blackmail commercially the local politicians, the local government, I mean, that you could, of course, extort quite a lot of privileges and protection, rights, and income. And that's basically what this history is about. And one that you fully legitimize, because, again, everybody was pretty much trying to do the same, and these guys were just better than. And, of course, there was a lot of cooperation with that, too, because being connected with these markets for economies, especially just think about the Russian one. It was not exactly a particularly developed one in Europe at the time. It was, of course, a great means that to help the local economies grow as well. So Lubeck, that has a beautiful history on its own, but today we talk about the one of the whole league, so we can't just stop on it, became soon the basis for mostly Saxon and Westphalian merchants. These northern Germans were some of the most invested in that aforementioned Ostsiedlung, colonization, mercantile expansion, populations or resettlements that also happen a lot. And in this case, Lubeck laid exactly in the best northeastern axis that would allow this German merchants to essentially bypass the Schleswig port. That was kind of fine, but it did not, as being part of a sort of more terrain power, was let's say providing less legal protections. It also was not a better access route to the Baltic than Lubeck, which in fact prospered dramatically for this reason as well. Obviously, there was a competition between Saxony, Schleswig. I made a video about Schleswig-Holstein, and I have to finish it also for actually this very centuries, because it has a very interesting history. There was again a wider frontier area Denmark was pushing, in fact, to try to close this for itself, like to reserve the control of these ports, but for itself, at least at various degree of political autonomy, essentially at that point becoming, as far as the German possessions were concerned, also an imperial vassal, aside from its Scandinavian independence. So this is what made, in many ways, Lubeck the most important city. Excellent position, early foundation, also this decentralization in general that the local community was able to, in fact, to cultivate further politically and institutionally. The city granted trade privileges to the Rusians and the Scandinavians as far as trade was concerned. It offered logistical support to the northern crusaders. This, for example, dramatically favored the relations with the Pope in the process. They could allow the crusaders and their retinues to embark themselves easily with this ship. Again, this is normal for the Middle Ages, that there are fleets around, but we've seen also how the Scandinavian monarchies still actually had a naval militia of sort, but there wasn't such a thing like a permanent fleet. And so the communal centers, we've seen it often in the Italian ones, were de facto the only ones that, albeit being formed by some sort of patriciate that regarded its ships as private, was able to put their naval forces together in case of warfare, in case of, again, in this case, also providing logistical support, plus gaining new trade rights. So this is exactly the same thing. Plus, Lubeck becomes a Freie Reichsstadt in 1226. This happens, as I was just saying, paradoxically under the rule of Valdemar II of Denmark. Right, so the guy, through the Holy Roman Empire, to which Lubeck belongs, even though he was the personal lord in this Danish dominion, conferred the title of Free City of the Empire. Right, the same had happened to Hamburg in 1189. Hamburg has a somewhat older history also because it was an important seat of a diocese that had been created as early as the 9th century to evangelize the Scandinavians. Then it had been destroyed by the Vikings, rebuilt. It's a different story, but similar one at this point. Also because Hamburg, of course, would become one of the major cities of the Hanseatic League. This is, again, the 13th century. We see lots of surrounding cities that would be part of the Hanseatic League receiving city rights, such as Wismar, Rostock, Stralsund, Danzig. These city rights are important in the sense that these centers are recognized as a communal reality, right? Of course, they are towns if you are preferring instead the scale, the dimensional side of the story. But they are all acquiring evenly their own autonomies, which correspond to an internal political and social development in parallel with commercial thriving. The greater purpose of the League was essentially to facilitate trade to all its elements abroad, right? It was sort of a huge mob capacity of some sort, for which if someone did something bad to one of your members, all the system would retaliate against even, again, major monarchies, right? To say, we will stop trading with you if you do something wrong, even to just one of our towns. Of course, these towns didn't within each other like necessarily each other that much. There were, again, fierce fractures and competitions between them. But in general, the system existed, like the League worked exactly because overall they understood that they were stronger together than individually. And there was, in fact, no center was capable, just by scale, just by nature of these towns, to be able to hegemonize one another. Of course, there were, again, some subdivisions that did correspond to some sort of hegemonic rule of a town or some others, but there was no capacity individually to extend the control over the entire League, right? We have the first documentary evidence, albeit this is not specifically, it's not specified at least as the answer, of a German commercial federation between 1173 and 1175. We get this from London, by the way, so we know that this broader association existed, of course, in one of the most important trade centers in Europe, like London was, essentially the biggest one in England by far, by scale. Important city, capital of a kingdom, and quite in need also of some, freer markets in London. At this time, of course, there is a broader connection with France, but there is an Englishness emerging as far as the capacity of, the island being sort of, the British island being more autonomous from other continental, closer continental markets. And the Hanseatic League provides that opportunity. We know that in this third quarter of the 12th century, the merchants of the Hanse in Cologne convinced King Henry II of England to exempt them from all tolls in London. Right. This is the degree that the Hanseatic League has reached in terms of power exertion over other countries. This means basically that you can sell everything without paying anything to the locals. This has some advantages, of course, for the local economy as a whole. It's rather the English merchants, the London merchants, that are not happy at all of this, and they will always try to convince the king to actually abolish those Hanseatic rights. But really, London alone does not have the mercantile capacity to compete with the Hanseatic League, and so the monarchy actually profits from an alliance with the latter, right? At this point, the Ostsiedlung was proceeding also along the Baltic coast in the eastern fringes of it as well, expanding in cities like Elbląg, for example, Torun, Tallinn, Riga, Tartu. This had some other names, including German ones, at the time because of this phenomenon, right? And these towns were just being established as part of the Hanseatic League. Some had been founded literally by as offspring of other of single towns. And this is this is evidenced not just by the sort of common style. Think about the brick Gothic, that is due to the fact that the type of rock that was available for building was essentially of the stamp that you see, like this red bricks. But also a common Hanseatic law, that was the Stadtrecht of Lubeck. The Lubeck law, as this was, as we've seen, the League's most prominent town. It was it was the best organized of all. And the Lubeck law was extended at some point to centers also in the continent, right? There were different ones. The other one was the Magdeburg law, that was more typically continental, in fact. But it really depended on which kind of centers these were. If they were on the rivers, as many of them were, like not on the sea. So there was a greater benefit for these towns, by the way, because the Lubeck law allowed the towns to appeal, as far as any legal matter was concerned, to Lubeck's city council, which made these towns importantly dependent, albeit still autonomous from the mother city, right? The aforementioned Magdeburg law was, however, used within the same Hanseatic towns. Danzig had that, for example. There was the Kulm law that was derived actually from the one of Magdeburg. So of course every town in the moment which was founded could sort of decide what their rights would have been, right? Some were fruit of a negotiation with local authorities, whatever. Everything was simpler in the moment which you had an homogeneous law to the one of another town, which the authorities were already habituated to cope. But there could be specific reasons why you wanted to modify one, right? That would always be, right? There's never a fully identical organization. From the 15th century, the Livonian Confederation would also take over different towns, especially in today's Estonian part of Latvia, that were part of the Hanseatic League, and at some point they modified part of the town rights, depending again on the situation. Was true, as we'll see now, also for other powers. There was at a point some sort of social transformation. I mean, medieval merchants, especially in the West, were normally making money by reinvesting this in land, property, which was at the end of the day the more lucrative. So this favored some social stratification, the establishment of a patriciate of some sort, and so the capacity to co-opt even other elements from the German society. For example, the ministeriales, about which I made many videos and will keep talking about, that were essentially the German knights, at least they were becoming by this point the prevalent. They were not prevalent as in southern Germany, like in the north, but these were essentially servant knights that, however, by this point had become pretty much alike the others, which meant an armed force for these towns. Nothing, again, particularly organized. Was no such thing like a common political body of the League or a common army, whatever. Like every town acted by itself. Of course, they would associate themselves, of course, but there was no such thing like a permanent institution, especially as far as these matters were concerned. And of course, these guys would serve in battle, in combat, at sea, on board of the ships, on land, etc. And this helped, of course, some of the Hanseatic towns to extend their power, their control over other settlements around, and subjecting them to their rule. There were also some complicated maneuvers as far as this is concerned, because given that the Hanseatic League were all formally independent, they would also have a lot of regulations, especially as far as land travel was concerned. This is typical of Germany until the Zollverein. Like, it's the idea that, every single tens of kilometers you have to pay yet another toll, and everything is so complicatedly heterogeneous. But there is no such limit at sea, where, in fact, these towns prosper. In 1241, Lubeck had access to the Baltic and North Seas fishing grounds, right? This brought to an alliance with Hamburg, which controlled at the time the access instead to the south roads from Lüneburg in the hinterland. This we've seen in Lower Saxon. This is we encountered this place when talking about the early stage of the Longoburg migration, but history goes on. So the Allied cities in this context gained thus control over most of the curing, the salted fish trade, especially the one from Scania. And specifically its market, there was a major one for herring taking place annually in the region. Right, it was actually one of the most important events around the Baltic Sea. By the 13th century, it was a major distribution center also for the broader Western European goods bound from Eastern Scandinavia. This is important. We will talk about Scania perhaps in some of these videos. At this point, Cologne, that was also quite versed, as we've seen in international trade through the Rhine, decided to join the League in the Diet of 1260. See, Cologne was ruled by an archbishop, but of course the town was a commune in itself. It was actually, this was a real city, right? It was the largest one in Germany, by the way, and a major trade center for this reason. And at this point, you start seeing how, again, Lubeck, Hamburg, Cologne, at least as the major centers, are starting to putting together things like armed forces. Nothing, again, enormously concentrated, but still, like, surgically operated. These were very mercantile-minded individuals, so they knew how to spend their money, right? They had joint interests. They were not, like, they were sort of different. I mean, Cologne with Lubeck has barely anything to do in the broader German world. For the rest, each own had their own local problems. They didn't care so much about one another, right? But in case of need, they would came to the aid of one another, especially as far as commercial issues were concerned. They would carry soldiers and their arms to one another via ship. And at this point, the Hanseatic League is literally booming. It's difficult to even understand exactly how many towns were there, because we do not have the exact documentation for each one, and some centers were also small, so it's normal not to have that, not even to be able to search for that in the first place. But it's been estimated that, in fact, at this time in the 60s of the 13th century, the Hanseatic League counted something between 70 and 170 towns. In all this, each center brought its own pregressed trading privileges in, because they all had a history before and behind this. For example, Cologne, because of its major role in Germany, in the Empire, and abroad, had considerable, to say the least, trading privileges in Flanders and England. In 1266, King Henry III of England granted Lubeck and Hamburg a charter for operations in England, partly because of this. this was not immediately met with great enthusiasm, for example, by the Westphalians, right? There were different factions within the group. The Cologne, Hansa, and the Wendish one joined in 1282 to form a joint colony in London that was under the within the Hanseatic League. But you see, they decided this autonomously. Also, they would not unite in this post until the 15th century. And of course, the Hanseatic League was fairly aggressive and reactionary. There were blockades against Novgorod, for example, in 1268 and in 77-78. This was normal. If you see also in the Mediterranean, it was normal that a mercantile presence was met at some point with hostility by the locals, so that they would be expelled or even killed, and their properties confiscated. But then, because of some political crisis and moment, and internal, also domestic affairs, and then you needed these guys back, and so you had to reopen, right? And of course, these guys could decide simply to blockade the enemy. What could these people do? They didn't really have the same naval power, and so there was technically nothing but remaining passive and suffering this until at least you were able to resist whichever the demands were, right? We find Westphalians in London, in Ipswich, in Colchester. These were, let's say, the most important trade posts in England. The Wendish traders, instead, they were essentially east of Lubeck, were sort of the less privileged, and they would opt for eastern England, northeastern England even. You have King's Lynn, also known actually until the 16th century as Bishop's Lynn, and Newcastle upon Tyne as Wendish trade centers. The interesting aspect of the Hanseatic League is, in fact, how it sort of balanced its own powers within, right? How flexible it was, how the individual towns searched for individual settlements by themselves, right? They weren't necessarily just sticking together all the time or even needing to do so, right? At times, of course, they were also divided over important issues, right? So the second half of the 13th century, the beginning of the 14th, is the moment of major consolidation of probably the North and Baltic Seas trade routes by the Hanseatic League. We see, for this reason, different towns, for example, in the Low Countries, such as Utrecht, but also other regions that we discussed more or less recently: Holland, Zeeland, Brabant, and Namur, Limburg, joining, saying, the bigger we are, the more powerful we can be. These were traditionally, especially in the lowlands, some very autonomous realities. We have seen it. There is a medieval Flanders playlist that explains this thoroughly. They were quite, commercially oriented towns themselves. We understand here there are also interland, like continental provinces, and so through rivers, canals, etc., there would be a broader participation to this trade activity. Of course, there was an Hanseatic terrestrial activity, terrestrial routes, and more we will see it better, even up to the heart of Germany and beyond. The League succeeded in establishing new kontors in important centers like Bruges, Bryggen, in Bergen, Norway, and London, as we've seen, the Peterhof in Novgorod. We'll see now better what kind of trade deals were there in those places, right? There were in some places it actually failed, or at least there was one outpost established in Bruges, but this would not become a major enclave of the Hanseatic League like the others. This depends on, again, the different vicissitudes of those centers. The London Kontor was known as the steel yard, right, from the Middle Low German Stahlhof, and it was located west of the London Bridge in the site now occupied by the Cannon Street station near Upper Thames Street. This is to say how neuralgic the center was and how much the Hanseatic trade was connected with the city of London, right? And we're talking about a major settlement. There was a way house, which was, again, quite important because there was a broader administrative capacity of evaluating the size of the goods. Of course, there was a church, offices, homes. These were just a German quarter within London, and it tells you just by also together with the warehouses, of course, and also the walls. We will see it in some other settlement, how concentrated and how sort of there for to stay these communities were. Right. There were sometimes outposts and factories that were, albeit not garrisoned, really part just as a property of the Hanseatic League. This was like if you trusted the local authority enough, you could have it as an asset. And it was, again, an important retaliatory deterrence that the Hanseatic League could put together, right? In Scania, which is southern Sweden, but part of the Danish domains at the time, there were something like 30 Hanseatic seasonal factories for salted herring, right, known as Fitten, which were managed with an important autonomy, right? They were not actually as important as the Kontors, but altogether they seemed like one, right? And this is typical of Scandinavia, that did not have such a great community concentration, so also the Hanseatic settlement was sort of more scattered, right? But at the same time, in fact, less efficient. But the important was earning enough out of the salted herring trade, and that's pretty much it. You have factories in England, in places such Boston. Also, this outpost was known as Stahlhof, for example. You have Bristol, Bishop's Lynn, which is also the place, by the way, where you can find the only remaining Hanseatic warehouse in the country: Hull, Ipswich, Newcastle upon Tyne, Norwich, Scarborough, Yarmouth, that is today's Yarmouth, York. Most of these factories were about cloth. This was, by the way, also displaying the power of the Hanseatic elites, because technically those factories were worked by English personnel that basically produced fabrics for the also the elites of the Hanseatic towns. Not only, by the way, but this is for saying that, of course, the Hanseatic League could pay as well for production abroad. And the Hanseatic League reaches far and wide. You find outposts in Lisbon, Bordeaux, Bourg-Neuf, the bay of which was basically the main area for mostly the collection of salt. Because this was the point, Bourg-Neuf, La Rochelle, Nantes were producing this cheaper salt of the bay, the Gulf of Biscay, and the connection between these centers and the northern Germany was known as the Salt Fleet. In fact, you find the Hanseatic outposts pretty much everywhere: Flanders, Denmark, Norway. We will see now how they were present in Poland, but also in Upper Germany. Yes, places like Nuremberg, Iceland, Venice, also Naples at some point in history was part of the Hanseatic League. As we were saying, many Hanseatic towns were actually not maritime centers. There was a wide continental trade depending on the Hanseatic towns on the North and Baltic seas. Naturally, the most important, say, continental centers to which the Hanse provided privileges were somehow closer to, in fact, northern Germany. Then you had important seaports like Bremen, Hamburg, and Riga that, yes, were just big centers of the league, but mostly had their status depending not much on their seaborne capacity as such, but the fact that they were located on important rivers, and so it was mostly what happened upstream that mattered. Think about the Rhine, right? The Rhine, which in this sense was not even controllable as a wall, so that while some of the aforementioned cities received important rights of navigation, for example, for the trade, for their passage, on the Rhine it was sort of more complicated. It was a busier riverway. Actually, there were canals, and many of them were being built during the 12th to 13th century, pretty much all around, especially in the west of the, say, in Flanders mostly. This would be seen as, instead, something more private, those who had actually built them locally, mostly the nobility. There was, for example, the Stecknitz Canal, an artificial waterway that connected Lauenburg and the same Lubeck. This was located on the old salt route, right? And this was achieved by linking actually very tiny rivers, the Stecknitz, in fact, and the Delvenau, and allowing thus essentially the passage between the Baltic and the North Sea, right? Between essentially Lubeck and Hamburg. That was the main thing, as Lauenburg on the Elbe as well was concerned. This was created. This canal was created between 1391 and 1398. But it's just for saying how, of course, crafty and considerate, just as far as territorial policies, these towns could be, right? It's all very complex when you look at who did what with whom, with which authority locally, etc. That's interesting how it intertwines with the feudal power in the interland as well. Needless to say, the Hanseatic League contributed dramatically to the development of northern Germany, that historically had not been a particularly rich area, right? Of course, the greater resources in Germany were concentrated in the south, along the Rhine, right? But these, let's say, northeastern Germany were fundamentally depressed, and yet the Hanseatic towns managed, in fact, to confer this land some important infrastructure, backbone, international connection, right? So trade increased. Mostly the main industry revolved around woolen and linen fabrics, sometimes even silks, right? That were all manufactured and exported from northern Germany. We see the crafts improving dramatically in, for example, etching, wood carving, armor production, the engraving of metals, wood turning, that is essentially a way to shape wood, right? Through cutting it in a symmetrical way around the axis of rotation. You have some particular material culture, the particular architecture of the region stemming from this in particular. The primary goods traded by the Hanseatic League were beeswax, furs, timber, resin or tar, flax, honey, wheat, rye. The arc of this, trade route was quite vast, especially from east to west. As we've seen, you would reach Flanders, England, that were mostly connected historically with the cloth industry, English wool exported in Flanders, which was worked as textiles exported. Eventually in the Champagne fairs, mostly until the 13th century effectively. The Hanseatic production here was, and trade was mostly revolving around broadcloth as far as textiles were concerned. You have an increased amount of other manufactured goods, but also this economy branching, specializing into various fields. For example, metal ore in mostly copper and iron and herring came southwards from Sweden. This was particularly important for Scandinavian politics because basically the Swedish hinterland in this way began to be ever more riotous, especially during the Kalmar Unionen, against those mostly Danish-dominated policies that wanted to subjugate the coastal centers of Germany with which they traded. You have important uprisings, as you know. But for example, the Carpathian copper and iron, something reaching the Hanseatic trade hub through Thorn, right, on the Vistula River. We will talk more about Poland in a while, because the Polish hinterland would become, especially in the 14th century, a major wheat exporter. Right. Also because Poland was spared apparently from the Black Death, considerable level, and it became a powerhouse of mostly poor, but again, in large quantity present products that were and raw material that were exported towards the north. Was mostly, in fact, on the coasts, German control. Eventually the Poles would take control of the coastal cities too. As we've seen, Lubeck was pretty much into salt trade. The salt was actually acquired also quite close range sometimes from the Lunenburg, but as we've seen, there was a southwestern European route to France, Portugal. There you had this other type of salt that arrived in large quantities, was sort of cheaper, but it was important because the Central European markets were relying on that. At some point, this is essentially the same salt used for the herrings that were in turn exported to the Rus as well. You have also unsalted fish, especially cod, dried by cold air and wind on wooden racks or on the foreshore, traded from Bergen in exchange for grain. This is particularly relevant because, as you know, the Norwegian hinterland is pretty rocky, mountainous, doesn't quite have much open ground and fertile fields, so grain had to be imported there in exchange for, instead, this fishing resources. And you understand how dependent Norway was on the Hanseatic trade as well. You find, in fact, Hanseatic grain being exported in remarkable quantities to the north. the Hanseatic beer was apparently a big deal. All right, Lubeck, Hamburg, Wismar, Rostock had hell of breweries for hopped beer that was apparently the best one around, and as far as I can remember, at least much later in the centuries, right? That the Hanseatic beer is still very good. The northern seas weren't peaceful at all. It was full of pirates throughout all this time, and the Hanseatic League had all specific protection measures, also insurances, etc., to cope with these inconvenience. Right. At some point, of course, the Hanseatic League could also hire privateers, right? And there was all a system of, again, requisition, legal procedures to cope with even ransoms, with all the issues that could occur in this violent space. But as we have already observed, the most powerful measures of the Hanseatic Leagues stood in their blockades. Right? For example, when Bruges moved the Hanseatic market of its city to Aachen between 1280 and 1282, from 1307 to 1308, or 1308 to 1310, and in 1350, the League retaliated. Right? The Flemish were doing this for their own reasons, but of course the League did not really care more than much. The same blockades occurred to Dort in 1358, 1388, Antwerp in 1436. It's again impossible now to digress on every single episode, because at this point this was connected to certain random local reasons, rivalries, or certain one of these ports trying to emerge, breaking through effectively the League monopoly. This is quite interesting. We will see how Amsterdam, for example, emerged from this struggle in the late Middle Ages. Norway was boycotted in 1284, Flanders in 1358, and the latter blockades actually caused famines in these regions, because without the Hanseatic products, right, the local economies would collapse. These are centuries in which, European markets are very intertwined, and so you can't really cause major damage to these regions. As we've seen, Norway there was importing grain and relied on it exactly for that reason. But think about the increase of the Danish influence. At some point, the Danes would scapegoat the Norwegians, and they sacrificed it for their own interest as well. There was some important naval power, not really, again, a permanent or fixed one, but again, every merchant ship at this point in history especially could be fitted for military purposes. Right? There was hardly any involvement of the entirety of the League in the military operations, just even for internal disagreements. But that would be individual stakeholders that, of course, were quite interested in particular theaters that would send naval forces to harass their opponents. This kind of alliances between guildsmen were known as Taupesaten, and they were an often eventuality. There was all a system of training pilots and also erecting lighthouses, right? Especially in the north, in winter, you have very few hours of light, effectively, and by the Renaissance, you can argue that the German and Scandinavian coastline thanks to the 15, at least 15 lights erected by the Hanseatic League, was essentially the most lighted sea in the world already, because of this reason. The first lighthouse was apparently erected by Lubeck in 1202 in Falsterbo, but there were, for example, other famous lighthouses. One you can see in Kopu, right, in Estonia, on the island of Yuma, right. And they're interesting monuments just to visit. They give you a sort of volumetric dimension of how big even these structures were for the times. So in many ways there is a bounce that the Hanseatic League has from the mid-14th century crisis, because of course they suffered of it, but since there is a moment of further shrinking of polities after the compaction of the 13th century in Europe, this contraction helps further the political autonomy of the League. Right, this is an autumn. Right, there is a long sunset of the Hanseatic League, and so actually problems had began to occur already, but the League exploited this moment to at least trying to counter what were the main problems on the horizon. Right, as we've seen in many videos, including a recent trilogy about so-called princely Germany, after the collapse of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, the German monarchy had basically disintegrated, and this helped somehow the Hanseatic League. As other leagues actually in the empire that were formed, think about the Landfriede, think about one of the Swiss confederates, for example, the various leagues that would form in Swabia on the Rhineland. The idea that this moment of chaos required an institutionalization of the local associations to better defend their own interests was emerging also among the Hanseatic League. Right, there wasn't actually any state again created at this point. The Kaufmann's Hanse was the closest thing existing to a general institution. Right, it was rather the attempt to create some sort of uniform cooperative method procedure that would hopefully facilitate the political and military reaction of the League in front of threats that were materializing. For example, the Danish king Henrik VI Manfred conquered many Wendish cities. The same happened between 1306 and 1319 with other centers at the hands of different feudal overlords that now were really unchained by the collapse of the German monarchy. Right, there was even the attempt of establishing a sort of periodical meeting center in the Hansetag, in fact the Hanseatic Diet of Lubeck, but it was very irregular. Right, we do not even know technically when did this happen, because again such meetings had always taken place in the Hanse towns, but some say that it's from essentially the beginning of the 14th century that they started doing so. Others point at 1356, that is the same year of the Golden Bull, and so the one of a general regulation of also the German principalities that thus were sort of consolidating and could expand against the League that was, as we've seen, by its nature relatively fragile. And these meetings were generally speaking a failure. I mean, many delegates of individual cities would not attend them. They would desert them before time to also give the other representatives an excuse, essentially to bail out themselves. There was a lot of self-sabotaging and actual internal divisions at this point that were already emerging. So in spite of this last moment of sort of vacuum filling, there was already the beginning of the political end. Considering all this, that the Hanseatic towns were at large unaffected by the conferment of the title of Free Imperial City. There was some greater interaction with the interland nobility that sort of fostered relations with the individual towns, mostly from a land base that was sort of detached in some way from the broader sea policy of the League, right? But this means that basically the Hanseatic League is left alone within the German institutional landscape. Nobody really recognizes it as something particularly relevant to remain. It was, after all, just a sack of the centralized communities that were trying to remain out of the centripetal efforts, instead of the various princely dynasties were gradually trying to regain ground after the end of the Hohenstaufen and again the collapse of the German monarchy. There was a Danish-Hanseatic War between 1361 to 1370. This was led by King of Valdemar against Lubeck specifically, and even though the first years of so important Danish victories, and there was even a moment of truce in 1365, which the League was exhausted, there was a recovery of the League that brought eventually to the defeat of the same Danes, right? And this, however, engulfed the region further. Scania and Öresund, with several coastal ports belonging to the Danish and the Norwegian monarchies, were attacked and raided. Copenhagen was ransacked, right? And there was, at the end of the day, the recognition of the Hanseatic League's position and influence over the Öresund fortresses. This was the most important strait, right? Essentially today between Denmark and Sweden, separating Zealand from Scania, right? This tells you the degree again of that was the most important contended area as far as the Danish affairs were concerned. Denmark was sort of, had been through really rough times, right? Was almost disintegrating, and very gradually from the hinterland they managed to hold on these fortresses and gradually oust historically the Hanseatic League, but it would take a long time before this was the case. And in fact, this victory sanctioned at the Treaty of Stralsund by Håkon VI of Norway and Valdemar IV of Denmark, that was his father-in-law, is considered the apogee of Hanseatic power. As such, it's not really the case. I mean, yes, they were that powerful, but things were starting to decline for them too. I mean, this contrast suit had a cost of some sort, but it's at least still remembered, together with the Confederation of Cologne, that was basically the group with that, together with Wendish, Prussian, and Dutch forces the League had fought with the, let's say, the sense of the imposition over Denmark. Where in fact this situation lasted only for 15 years. In 1385 the Øresund fortresses were returned to Denmark because holding them also was a cost, and it shows you how, aside of course from the pressure that could be exercised by these enemies, right, these external actors, the Hanseatic League was not really a territorial power as such, right? They were just about the sea, and even if fortresses could be held profitably at some point, if these had been part of a major political landmass that, in spite of the crisis, could in fact recover at some point with some substantial land forces, and also, of course, maritime ones, there wasn't much that you could do profitably to oppose yourself to it at that point, at that time. So I think this is the just prefiguring what the main problem of the same league would have been by this point. And after all, with the second half of the 14th century, you have the Scandinavian monarchies regaining steam, right? There were problems broadly meant in Scandinavia. For example, Albert of Mecklenburg, who was king of Sweden, and Margaret I, Queen of Denmark, went at war, right, as Vladimir's heir Olaf died, famously enough, and this increased the attrition with Denmark, because Albert hired in 1392 the famous Victual brothers, that were some privateers from Germany, being connected with these more territorial actors that contrasted the League. And in fact, the Victual brothers were a scourge that harassed the Hanseatic traffics from 1392 and the 30s of the 15th century. For 3 years, from 1395-98, the same Stockholm was ruled by a consortium of 7 Hanseatic towns that were under the release agreement of Albert of Mecklenburg. The Victual brothers controlled Gotland, still by that time, when the Teutonic orders decided to put an end to this, also because the Prussian towns were quite dependent on what was happening in Sweden, this brought also to the transfer of Gotland to Denmark in 1408. The Teutonic order at this point had sort of acted as a protector of the League interests. The sense that the Grand Master of the Ordenstadt was sort of the main leader of the Hanseatic League, some sort, but just out of prestige and because it was an imperial authority, but still sort of outside the broader German affairs and very connected with the Baltic trade that, of course, had allowed the same state to exist, right, through the Hanseatic commerce, etc. Is a proof that the same league, however, needed at this point some active protection, that because of these turmoils in Scandinavia, the same league could not act effectively anymore, nor was prepared to endure a much greater struggle, and it could be even these privateers between Germany and Sweden that could effectively damage it. The 15th century kept witnessing this crisis that was paralleled by the continuous effort of institutionalization of the same league. The reason being that these towns realized now that there were more powerful actors outside, that the world was sort of changing. The Scandinavian monarchies were coming back, be more powerful, also the German princes. There were difficulties also with the Teutonic Order, to say the least, right after Tannenberg, especially in 1410. So they were starting to freak out, in a way or another. And this took the form of actually a gradual falling apart of various cities under other powers' orbit. And it was that, in fact, suddenly there was not a big crack, because there was no central structure to crack in the first place. It was just these towns starting to go their own way, and the system declining in spite of their, again, commercial maritime vocation that they would maintain over the centuries, but still not with that overall international power that they had, nor of course the cooperation between these towns. There is an effort, for example, to strengthen the ties with the various Kontors, especially the one of Bergen at this point, because evidently the relation with the Danes and the Norwegians were increasing. This, however, happened pretty late during the century, when, again, the situation was evidently irreparable. There was a new war with Novgorod. Conflict went on during the 80s of the 14th century, until the League regained its trade privileges in 1392, which were granted only in exchange for Rusian, Novgorodian privileges in Livonia and Gotland. The Rusians were not particularly sensitive to things like human mercy, and in 1424, in the Petershof Kontor of Novgorod, German traders were imprisoned, and 36 of them died in the process. The Novgorodans, again, were overall actually not the main problem that the Hanseatic League had, but when they got angry, they sort of, caused bloodshed, and they had a pretty brutal way of handling these German merchants, right? There was also a war going on at this point between the same Novgorod and the Livonian Order, an autonomous branch, as you know, of the Teutonic one, for which, of course, the League supported the latter, blockading Novgorod, leading to the abandonment of the Peterhof for 6 entire years, from 1443 to 1448. So again, that very important connection market was declining, right? But all this during a moment in which actually the Russian grain from the north was being exported through the Baltic, the North Sea, up to places like Portugal, for example. So it's not to say even that there was less at stake at this point, or a generalized decline. On the contrary, here the European system is sort of regaining steam, and the Hanseatic League has a difficulty in keeping up with that. There were troubles with the English as well since the 70s of the 14th century. This was caused by the fact that the English merchants had been gaining by themselves autonomously some privileges in Prussia in the treaties of Marienburg 1388 1409, and this was all happening at the expense of the Hanseatic trade, not just in Prussia, but in the same England, because evidently those merchants were just, of course, bringing things home just in a much more direct way, and England was definitely strengthening as a kingdom as well, recovering from different crises, in spite of the fact, of course, these were times. They were not easy times for anyone, but It's the specific weight of these countries that increases proportionally, and the Hanseatic League is not a country, right? That's the problem, politically and territorially. Europe at this point compacts, right? There are some countries that shrink, they're destabilized, but they rebuild from a much more strongly territorial base than before, properly with a state, etc. And so this is not the day of the major civilizational expansion of the 12th to 13th century, in which these towns could flourish, exploiting, the fluidity of the situation and bullying, right, these various neighbors. Now it's payback time to some extent, right? There are also problems within the same league, of course. The Wendish cities, for example, were threatened from the hinterland by the Prussian market, right? Everything east of Lubeck now was risking to be alienated. Lubeck was very central, as we've seen. It's actually during this century that it reaches the top power, but the Prussian main interest was the export of bulk products like grain and timber to England, so essentially passing beyond the Hanseatic hegemony, and they wanted to simply, as we'll see now, exercise a pressure from the hinterland over these centers. Consider that the Polish products were exported as far as the Low Countries, also to Spain and Italy. So we're talking, again, ever larger trade routes, especially long-reaching ones. This is especially typical of the period. We've seen it in various videos about late medieval economy. And no doubt this required the control. It was mostly an elite market, a luxury one, compared to previous times, and this required, in fact, those territorial states that were forming in the hinterland to take the matter in their own hands. And it was Frederick II, the Elector of Brandenburg. I made a video about the Markgrafschaft for the historical regional series that forced the Hanseatic Leagues in Prussia, specifically Berlin and Köln in 1442, blockading, by the way, all the Brandenburg towns from participating in the Hanseatic Assembly, overall assemblies. This meant for a substantial amount, albeit not all, the towns of Brandenburg, the end of their participation to the Hanse. In 1488, John Cicero, John II, the Elector of Brandenburg, did the same to other towns such as Stendal, Salzwedel in the Altmark, subtracting ever more resources from the League. A similar dynamic was occurring in the west when the cities of Holland and Zeeland, actively participating in the Hanse, abruptly abandoned it in 1395 because of their feudal obligations to Albert I, Duke of Lower Bavaria, who at that point was fighting against the Frisians, and this began with literally these towns not responding to the Hanseatic alliance because they were involved in this war against Frisia. But it also marked, as we will see now, an increasing distancing of the Flemish towns from the Hanseatic business, especially since between 1417 and 1432 these lands were essentially integrated in the Burgundian state that had, in fact, its own logic. I made a video about the administration, the government of the Burgundian state. There was a much more continental thing, and could also back the Flemish towns with a cohesive interest, reinforcing the local foundation, also the national feeling. of the Seine that was essentially being molded at this point to act independently from other groups and actually returning to be more, let's say, evidently part of a compact province territorially speaking, and not much just about the North Sea trade as such. Plus, there is a financial earthquake at the foundations of the same league when in 1403 Lubeck's government is found guilty of financially maladministration, let's say, and this brought to the creation of a supervising committee 2 years later and a crisis 3 years later that basically led to the replacement of the entire town council of Lubeck, and so a literal change of regime and establishment. Fascinatingly enough, this occurred in other centers as well. It means that there was something going on politically, like there was a leadership that was trying to save itself, and in this broader mess and crisis of the league, they couldn't really achieve that. We find the same dynamic in Bismarck, in Rostock, where new town councils were established in 1410. There was some, of course, it was not a revolution to court. The same patricians who stayed there sort of maintained their own importance. There were negotiated compromises in 1418. Also because the weaker the league seemed, the more its enemies would press further to weaken it. It was, however, the Scandinavian situation that would give more troubles, let's say, to the league, because Eric of Pomerania, who had been ruling over the Kalmar Union, and so technically a union of all the Scandinavian monarchies under the Danish guidance, under this ruler from 1396 to 1439, decided to expand territorially in 1412 over Schleswig and Holstein, which required naturally more financial resources. And these were essentially extolled from the Hanseatic traffics through the Öresund crossing, which, as we've seen, was a bit vital because, in spite of, as we've seen, internal canals and whatever, this was the main connection between the Baltic and the North Sea. And this caused a crisis in the Hanseatic League because different towns reacted differently, right? Lubeck was trying to slow down the Danes, like trying to find peaceful compromise as far as Schleswig and Holstein were concerned. Hamburg was more warlike instead. They began to finance the Count of Holstein against Eric. Finally, the latter policy triggered the Dano-Hanseatic War 1426-35, which was really declared by 6 Hanseatic cities, including Lubeck and Hamburg at the end of the day, and that substantiated itself in a naval blockade of the Scandinavian harbors, and with support of Henry IV, the Count of Holstein, against Henry. This went in parallel with the famous Swedish revolt of Engelbrecht in 1434-1436. This is actually an Hanseatic victory at the end of the day, because with the Treaty of Vordingborg, the Hanseatic towns become accepted from the Sound dues. Also, they let's say they had some extensive privilege recognition in the let's say North and Baltic Sea. Yet this also entailed an increased Dutch activity in Baltic trade. Also, the increase of Swedish autonomous rights and privileges. This war was particularly pernicious for the Kalmar Unionen as a whole. So you see that in spite the Hanseatic League manages to maintain its own preeminence as the major commercial power in the region, there are other actors that are starting to rise. And here we are in the 15th century. You see already the Dutch and the Swedes gaining weight, in spite of the fact that, of course, Denmark is sort of the major adversary as a whole, as the most powerful Scandinavian monarchy. Impressive during this war had been the Hanseatic bombardment of Copenhagen. It was bombarded twice, right, by the ships of the 6 northern German Hanseatic towns, which is also interesting as far as naval warfare is concerned, because you have an increasing firepower that can damage land targets. First attack had been repelled in April 1428, but the one of June the 15th of the same year was successful. And there was, of course, a Danish fleet operating as well, but being destroyed during this operation, right? So it's an important feat, right, in the history of naval warfare. Perhaps we will cover in detail in another video, right? And this had caused, by the way, a crisis within the same Denmark. Eric of Pomerania was deposed in 1438, and especially Lubeck, that was the most invested city, took control of the Öresund toll. This was a dangerous measure because the Dutch were not happy at all, nor Zeeland really was. The rights that, as we've seen, were granted to Lubeck on the Sound brought the Hanseatic League to attempt at least to exclude the English and the Dutch from Scania because of the aforementioned herring trade locally that was quite a thing. But it sort of backfired at this point because both England and the Netherlands began to develop their own herring industries. And this is also the mark of a war that was changing in a more structural way. Here it's not just about resources grabbing, it's also having a polity, a system that is able to infrastructurally and economically support also on land just a production, right, that could be sheltered from enemy attacks, that has probably the numbers to and the output to compete with other lands. I mean, it's not that Scania was just the only place where you could develop a flourishing herring trade from, and actually, in fact, things would change importantly in the following centuries. You have also war against the Netherlands. This is quite fascinating because between 1438 and 1441, the merchants of Amsterdam began to push for their place in the northern trade that up to that point the Vendish towns especially had prevented. As we've seen, there had been a weakening of the Lubeck power. This war was, by the way, fought mostly through proxies, privateers paid by the various groups. And even though the Hanseatic cities was victorious, it also lost the exclusive, like the monopoly on grain export, right? It brought to the Dutch succeeding in exporting, especially, in fact, their own grain that had been blockaded during the war, like the one of Holland and Zeeland, as a response from the Hanseatic towns, right? But there was also not much of an interest at this point to keep on blockading and making this war. So actually little fighting for that matter was not a great deal of conviction in this. This peace treaty, by the way, was arbitrated by Denmark. But it's interesting because the Netherlands start having their saying, albeit timidly initially, in this area. In 1454, you have interesting developments in Poland, Lithuania. In fact, Elizabeth of Austria, that was the daughter of Albert II of Germany, had married Casimir IV Jagiellon. This had been a major victory for Poland, Lithuania, which decided to push further against the Teutonic Order, joining in the Prussian Confederation against it, asking Casimir for help. A consequence of this war was further territorial losses for the South Teutonic state. We discussed this in multiple videos, leading Danzig, Thorn and Elbing to be incorporated to the Kingdom of Poland. This territory continentally was referred to as Royal Prussia and was essentially part of the crown of the Kingdom of Poland now, by the second peace of Thorn, which was signed in the Hanseatic city, in fact, of Thorn, manifesting the involvement of these cities and the fact that they were essentially passing, however, under a different protector. Because of the marriage with Elizabeth, Casimir was sponsored in this by the Habsburgs, that were pushing at that point for, again, a consolidation of Poland, the expansion over the Hanseatic cities in the region. The same Krakow, the most important Polish city and capital de facto, had some historical trade associations with the Hanseatic League. But it wasn't a peaceful deal here that we see between Poland and the broader Hanseatic power. Actually, what happened is finally the Poles acquire the control over the Vistula mouth, which entailed a direct control on the city, which saw its political freedom significantly reduced in exchange for its actual growth. I mean, Danzig would be a very autonomous city after all within the Kingdom of Poland, but not as it had been before. The Poles benefit enormously at this point for their grain exports. As we were saying before, there is a massive Polish production that finally now can pass directly through a Polish-held, Polish-controlled at least, Hanseatic city. We're talking about a yearly grain export of over 9,000 tons in the late 15th century. This would boom like in tens of times more in the 17th, but that's also another story, a different world, right? This effectively brought the Hansa-dominated maritime grain trade into Polish hands. You have all a series of inconvenience. The House of Griffin, the Griffin dynasty of the Duchy of Pomerania, began to harass the Hanseatic towns of its hinterland, its coastlands as well. Bogislav X of Pomerania subjugated Stettin and Köslin, so endangering the entire Hanseatic independence. So you see, it's all different pieces falling apart. It's not even to say that the League was not important or renowned internationally. For example, Lubeck and Danzig kept building and selling ships throughout Europe. In the 15th century, you have also a considerable development, of course, of the northern ship models, because there was an increase in Atlantic traffics in general. So the system does grow, but it's gradual, the political relevance of the League to decline in relative terms, right? You have also certain anachronisms in the way this system had just handled itself. For example, new mediums of exchange were imported from Italy that was, especially as far as banking was concerned, much more advanced, but also the Italians that had largely developed their trade fortune, made several videos about this, from also de facto independent communes, had evolved into actual territorial states, which the Hanseatic League had not, right? Again, there were just a cluster of towns, whereas the Italian maritime republics, big Venice at this point, had created an actual regional state on land, actually with the most updated army of the time, together with the one of Burgundy. So it's a completely different model, and a centralized one, by the way, that is pretty much what the other powers in Europe are pursuing here, including, again, the Scandinavian monarchies. Doesn't matter how late, also the northeastern German principalities are very archaic in many ways, but they are definitely compacting towards that direction. And again, the League does not have the consistency, and especially from land, to oppose themselves to this mechanism, and they have to suffer the reversals due to the affirmation of much bulkier systems, right? The Dutch, as we've seen, are sponsored by the same Burgundian state, right? And this undermined deeply, especially as far as the control of grain trade. The same was concerned that the same internal cohesion of the League, because the Dutch were to import Prussian and Livonian grain, and the Wendish towns of the Hanseatic League were at this point, at odds like with the situation. They had difficulties of coping with that. The Dutch had also more competitive costs. At this point, the Hanseatic League was mostly acting as the medium of this trade that now was activated by this different center, like the Dutch having a greater draw now. There were wars, by the way, between the Dutch and the League at different points, and Amsterdam was rising aggressively as the leading center for Polish and Baltic grain marketing in the late 15th century, and they would continue in that escalade. Speaking of the Hanseatic continental reach, we notice an important connection between northern Germany and Franconia, the latter especially centered around Nuremberg, right? Essentially, the Hanseatic merchants had managed to create an overland route which would control, through their just financiary force, the transfer of products from Frankfurt via Nuremberg and Leipzig to Poland and the Rus. This is fascinating because it's not just like a massive Central Eastern European territorial dimension, but it involves the trade of Flemish cloth, French wine, so sort of, higher quality products for raw material like grain, furs from the east. This was facilitated by the granting to Nuremberger merchants of trade rights in the Hanseatic towns. This developed also a Franconian trade with Sweden, exemplified by the Moldenhauer family that essentially expanded with first Albrecht and then his sons Wolf and Burkhard, a trade with Sweden and Norway, right? These German financiers settled themselves in Bergen and Stockholm as Hanseatic agents, importantly enough. The only positive note around these years internationally being the reconfirmation of the Hanseatic privileges in the Treaty of Utrecht of 1474 by Edward IV of England, thanks to the fact that the League had helped financially the House of York during the Wars of the Roses. The Rus was also a troubled area. Novgorod was taken over by the Muscovy. We'll have to talk about Novgorod at some point. The Muscovite Prince Ivan III closed the Hanseatic Kontor in Novgorod in 1494. He also wanted to properly eliminate the Hanseatic influence in the Rus, but he deported the Hanseatic merchants of Petershof to Moscow to have them, doing something useful there. And only 49 Germans remained in Novgorod. Naturally, there couldn't be the end of an international trade there, but this was an important blow for the Hansa. This also created a redirection of Hanseatic trade, as we've seen, towards the continent that reached the same routes. And in fact, part of this trade was redirected to Leipzig, and Saxony was witnessing an important growth. There was also in the Baltic redirection of trade to Riga, Reval, Pleskow, which up to that point had not been so important as Novgorod in the trade towards the Rus. Right, the Hanseatic presence in Novgorod reopened formally in 1514, and as we've seen, there were some Germans there, but the center would never be as important as before for the League. In all, the picture is quite eloquent, right? The end of the Hansa would come later. So you can't speak properly in the 16th century the same degree of power that the Hansa had enjoyed previously. And it is painful to see. In many ways, you can appreciate the fact that there was an important continuity and effort to reinvest a little bit the strength of the Westerners in different fields, in different branches, in different countries that were open. Right now, Europe was an ever more intertwined system. European banking, as we've seen in the West, was very, very developed. All right, but the Hanseatic League had remained behind, if you want, properly in the concept of politics. It's what I was saying about the beginning, in terms of what is freedom. Right, liberty is a very different and more effective thing than freedom, and in this, the Hansa had attempted also to maintain some good relations with other powers, but it was the consistency of these towns that wouldn't quite be recovered that easily. Some of these centers would actually prevail over the others. You can argue that the Hanse also shrinks as far as the importance of the say, well, few major cities is concerned. As we've seen in the case of Danzig, also in other videos, there is an important pride in independence and wealth, right? There is no doubt that Danzig, for example, was the more entrepreneurially developed and commercially thriving city in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, right? But it is, in this sense, part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It is still traditionally, again, it's just like saying how Lubeck was part of the Kingdom of Germany, of the Holy Roman Empire, and maintaining its traditional freedoms, right? But in the European political landscape, of course, you have ever better defined political territorial states of regional size that properly the Hanse had not bought into as a concept. It was completely alien to that. It's, again, this group of, in what they think of themselves, of free towns that that owe technically nothing to one another and just join freely because they are free and nothing else, right? So this system was very effective in the 13th and the 14th century, before especially the crisis of the Black Death didn't kick in. After that, it was sort of devoid of the antibodies to survive the rise of regional states, and this is essentially what makes the Hanseatic League something extremely peculiar in its own kind. Again, leagues, we've seen them were present, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, was very fragmented. The Rhine one, the Swabian one, the Lombard one, but in many ways, all these places had witnessed eventually some sort of regional development. The Hanseatic one had remained decentralized because of some weaker northern German principalities and Scandinavian monarchies, and when these recompact, and also other states in the longitudinal stretch, like between the Baltic and the North Sea, that was the actual major route of communication in the north, and of course the most important route in the first place for Hanseatic trade, rose and sort of break this in various sections. Of course, ipso facto, the Hanseatic League loses that advantage and declines, right? So this is the broader idea. Again, these remain rich towns. They keep developing in the Renaissance and beyond. They're part of, again, of other systems that are also flourishing in their own ways, but it's never the league as a whole. It's never something so preeminent as it had been dictating rule to this or that realm, right? Of course, there was some room for political interference here and there, but let's not exaggerate. So I hope that this was comprehensive picture of what we mean just by addressing every polity for its own specificities, its own, and this the Hanseatic League is very characteristic. There is no doubt. Again, I think the Hanseatic cities are some of the most beautiful ones in Europe. They really make you understand what that kind of spirit really is. It's not something you find, even if it's close in, say, in the German towns or the Scandinavian ones. It's something really peculiar that really echoes still within those walls, in the outhouses, in the broader outlook of these communities. And I really treasure that as a European, because our old world is definitely something extraordinary, and much of what I do here is aimed at showing how much strength in this compaction, right, of Europeanness really is, in spite of its diversity, but in its also similarity, in the way we declined similar concepts, the same ones, as a matter of fact, in tradition, and how the world, of course, takes its course and how we can still, however, start from this basis to reverse the fall and reverse what, not much what has made us different per se, but what was the mistake in the, let's say, in the fall in the first place, in the diversion from the unitary purpose in the first place. And I think this is the a very important topic that we will talk at some other point. And I think this is well exemplified by the Hanseatic League, its capacity of union, but also its the necessity of something more solid to go on civilization. Now, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.